Hey guys, welcome back to the layout once again, and welcome to part 2 of our Overpass project down here. Today we're going to look at everything it's going to take to finish up the scene which we started a couple of videos ago, and that'll cover everything from assembling the retaining walls, painting everything, weathering, and even installing the handrails like you see there. The one thing we're not going to talk about, and this is probably disappointing, and I can understand why, but we're not going to talk about the grass or the dirt like you see right here. But don't worry, that's going to be an entirely separate video so that we can go more in-depth into that topic there. But I did finish this up just so it would look nice and also so that we could get our final details installed. So hopefully you guys are excited. By the end of this video, we'll complete the scene, or at least look at everything it took to complete this little scene down here. And then it'll be time to move on to the rest of the scene over here in Crawford. So with the bridge structure and the abutments all complete, I then turned my attention to working on the profile for our retaining walls. And before I really got to cutting any plastic, I thought about what the land around the abutments would look like, and using some 1/2-inch pink foam, I first created a sort of profile board that would sit inside or underneath the bridge and then extend out from the actual wall, like the drywall for our tunnel portal. It would extend out from there and then create the profile for both the slope of the hill that would lead up to the road, as well as the profile for the actual retaining walls themselves. Then similarly, using a knife and a sanding block, I vertically stacked together some smaller pieces of that 1/2-inch foam, and together those formed that slope that I talked about that worked its way from the ground all the way up pretty much to the entire height of the abutment. Now at this point there was still quite a bit of shaping to do regarding the foam, but I felt pretty good with the general landform that we had going, so I decided to turn my attention to actually building the retaining walls. And this was sort of a challenge because I wanted to create a grid pattern with a 1/2 vertical offset, and basically all that meant for me is that I was going to have to cut out a bunch of tiny plastic squares. So I first took a 2/100 of an inch sheet of styrene and then drew out a grid, a 5/8 of an inch grid, because I determined that that was about the size of panel that I wanted on my concrete retaining wall. So once I had the grid all drawn out in pencil, I then scored it with an X-Acto blade, and this made it easy enough to just snap the rows and columns into separate pieces, and then from there I could actually break off the individual squares. So with the pieces separated, I then glued them to another 2/100 of an inch styrene sheet, but this one I had actually cut out to fit inside of the staging room portal and then extend out past the abutments and match the profile of those foam boards that I had cut earlier. So this is really the final shape of the retaining wall that I had cut out on a flat smooth sheet, and now what I'm doing is applying each of those small little squares to the retaining wall profile to sort of decorate it and give it some texture. Of course, the squares didn't fit perfectly on the sheet. There was quite a bit of overhang pretty much in every column that I laid. So this was no problem. All I had to do was flip the retaining wall over, and I'm only working on one right here in the video, but of course there were 2 retaining walls and I just used the same process. So once I had it turned over, once again I took my X-Acto blade, scored the back side of those concrete panels, or what are supposed to be concrete panels, and once they were scored I was able to just sort of bend them over and they snapped right off. And then just like the retaining walls on my prototype inspiration, I decided to add a ledge along the top edge, and to do this I just took 2 rectangular pieces of styrene, and at the moment I'm forgetting the dimensions and I don't have the notes in front of me. I will try to put all of my items, the list of things I used, in the description, so check that out. Now, as perfect as I was trying to be, not everything matched up perfectly. There were a few corners here and there where the seams didn't match up perfectly and I left a little bit of a gap. This was of course no problem. I just took some squadron modeling putty, and spread that over the gaps or any visible seams. And once it dried, I sanded it, and then it was pretty much imperceptible wherever there were any seams, where I really, in the end, intended for them to look like it was a continuous piece of concrete. And this was particularly true for that ledge that I applied along the top edge of the retaining wall. I wanted that to look like it was a single piece rather than two different sections put together, if you know what I mean. With the putty all dried and sanded, then came the fun part. This is where things, I think, really started to take visual shape. I decided to take all the pieces outside. I grabbed just a random can of flat gray primer that I found in the garage because I thought that would be a nice base coat, and I spray painted all the pieces. So this was the actual bridge itself, the two abutments, and the two retaining walls as well. Then I took all the pieces inside and I worked on lightening that color with a very light gray, almost whitish acrylic mixture that I put in my airbrush. And honestly, I probably could have skipped the spray paint part, but in hindsight, I think it also provided a bit of grit for that airbrush to stick, so that it didn't rub off of the smooth plastic. So after a few tries, I finally got the light gray color I was really looking for, and then I moved to painting the road lines. Of course, the road here is only about 10 inches long because the scene really isn't that wide, so this wasn't a huge task. I just took some, regular blue masking tape, cut a really fine, narrow strip, and I used that to mark the middle of the road, and that sat between what would become the two yellow lines. Then I took some wider strips of masking tape and placed them on either side, and this set the parameters for each of those lines. And with the masking tape in place, I then decided that I was going to paint those lines using a cosmetic brush rather than my airbrush, and some yellow paint that I mixed up. Using these acrylic paints, I made sure to vary the color just a little bit here and there as I worked along the road, just so that the paint looked like it was aged a little bit and wasn't so uniform. And then after this, one of the final steps regarding painting was adding a bit of weathering. So I took some gray powders. These are weathering powders from AIM or AIM, I don't know what they want me to say, but I always call it AIM. And I didn't really do anything too heavy, just a bit of streaking on the road, and then on the retaining wall I just really tried to make the panels a little uneven. Again, I didn't want to darken them too much or make it look like there were huge streaks or rust spots anywhere. I just wanted to make it look like each of those squares wasn't exactly the same as the next one, because concrete usually has sort of a mottled appearance to it. Using a very similar mixture then, I also weathered the road. And again, this was a subtle weathering. As I was doing it, I couldn't really see too much progress, but I just went with some light, long strokes and added a bit over time, and eventually some tire tracks started to appear over the light sun-bleached road surface, and I think this created a really cool effect, and it's super easy to do with these weathering powders. So now that all of the individual pieces were complete, minus the railings, which I need to be glued onto the retaining walls, and that'll come in a second, but with everything painted and weathered, I then decided to glue down the abutments, because of course we don't want this scene to move around at all. So I just applied a bit of glue to the cork base, which we applied in the last video, and then I actually slid the bridge section on top of it and then weighted it down. But of course I didn't glue the bridge in because I want this to actually be removable when all is said and done. And I was a little concerned that even though I didn't glue the bridge in place, that even after the abutments dried, if I took the bridge out, that it wouldn't slide back in nicely, but it actually turned out that everything is a little snug now, but it does work and the bridge is removable, so that all worked out quite well. So returning to our foam pieces that we were working on in the beginning of the video, I took my retaining walls and then glued them to their respective profile boards, just using the same white Elmer's glue that I used to glue down the abutments. And then after those were dried, I glued the stacked sections of half-inch foam that I used to create the landform or the slopes on either side of the road. I glued those to the layout as well, and as those were drying, I then took those retaining wall sections and glued the two foam faces together. What I did avoid doing was actually gluing anything to the plastic structures that I had built, because somewhere down the road I'd like to be able to reuse the abutments and the road and the retaining wall. So the only pieces that I glued to the foam were the retaining walls on that inside face, but I made sure that I didn't glue down any of the surrounding foam pieces to the abutments. Now there's really only one last thing to do, or I guess a couple things to do before we can move on to scenery, and that'll be a topic which we cover in upcoming videos. But for this video and for this little project here, I needed to touch up the fascia, because the fascia that I had installed originally was completely flat and just matched the profile of the plywood. So surprisingly, this actually went quite well. All I did was find a scrap piece of hardboard. I then drew the profile of the scene, or the land contour on the inside of the board, and then cut it out with a jigsaw. And then, using some liquid nails, heavy-duty adhesive, I laid a bead along the top edge of the existing fascia. I also cut out a small piece of foam, which I glued on multiple sides. I set that on the inside of the abutment, which is exposed to the outside of the scene, and then I propped up the new fascia piece and just sort of held it there for a few seconds, but the adhesive grabbed quite well, and I just let it dry. And when I came back, it was all solid as rock. And the very last detail to add were the railings that go on either side of the retaining walls. And as it turns out, I had an old Walther's Cornerstone detail kit that had all sorts of railings and ladders in it, and I found a couple of railings that were slanted or sort of at an angle, and it matched the exact profile of the retaining walls that I had cut out. So this was more serendipity than actual planning, so I just sort of got lucky here. But the railings look great. The only modification that I made was trimming off the last stanchion and its associated handrails. And then I also cut the feet of the stanchions at a slight angle so that they would glue easily to the retaining walls. With the railings glued down on the retaining wall, that's really the last step there is for our overpass, so we're going to call it quits today. That's all there is for our little project down here. Before we move on to other projects, I just want to give you a quick overview of what we've done over the past couple of videos. So you can take a look at the painting and weathering up here on the road. In case you were wondering too where the grass and dirt came from, don't worry, you didn't miss anything. That'll be in an upcoming video. The reason that I included it here in this video is because I wanted to get our railings glued on our retaining wall. That was that last little detail, and you can see that looks pretty good as well. But I needed to have the dirt and grass around it glued down, because if I did it the other way around, I'm pretty sure I would have knocked off those railings. So anyway, I'm really happy with this. You guys will have to share your thoughts, and if you have any questions, of course, leave those below as well. But again, that's all there is for our overpass project down here. But don't worry, there's plenty more to come up. As I mentioned, we'll talk about dirt and grass soon. I've also got some custom grade crossing panels in the works, and I've even started on Annan Street down there, so that'll be a separate video as well. So as always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to stay tuned, and I will see you guys next time.